Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football, from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
Thanks for tuning in to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessica Kofi. In college football, there are certain established roles that we're really used to seeing a lot of the time, such as quarterbacks are usually the position that gets the most attention and considered the most important, or most programs that get national attention come from Power 5 conferences, stuff like that. But every once in a while, there are programs, or more importantly, players who break out of that mold. And of course, whenever that happens, it usually ends up turning into a legendary story. And a lot of times, the legends that we do know now were built in some of the most unusual and out of the norm circumstances. So all of that being said, in this episode, we're going to narrow in on one specific area in college football that lies outside the norm. And we're going to highlight 5 future NFL superstars who actually had humble beginnings in small college football programs. So to kick things off and get started in the first segment, we're going to touch on one of my personal favorite NFL players in history, and that's running back Walter Payton out of Jackson State. And full name, Walter Jerry Payton, and for anyone who wasn't already aware, and not a super fan like I consider myself to be. Was born in July of 1954 from Columbia, Mississippi, and he got his start as an athlete in high school. Obviously, was named an all-state player while he was in high school. But even given that, he still didn't receive a lot of scholarship offers from predominantly white schools. And given the time period that he came up in, being born in 1954, that was sadly, but quite obviously, really expected. And there weren't really SEC schools at the time that were accepting black players, and that was really the norm. So understanding what the limits were, and after originally committing to Kansas State, he decided to stay close to home ultimately and go to Jackson State, which is where his older brother Eddie played. And there's also rumors stemming from his autobiography that he was recruited by Kansas as well, but Kansas to this day still denies that. Either way, he ended up choosing Jackson State in Mississippi, alma mater of his older brother Eddie, who went on to play 5 NFL seasons for the Minnesota Vikings. But when he first got to Jackson State, he began to attract national attention after he made the starting lineup as a freshman in 1971. So from there on, it really is, like the cliche says, history. And that's when he acquired his legendary name, Sweetness. And a lot of people say it came from a combination of his personality and how friendly and comfortable he was, and his athleticism and how graceful he looked while he ran on the field, which definitely was something that didn't change throughout his career. And there's also a little bit of a rumor that it's possibly also a sarcastic description of his playing style and what it might look like to certain people. But given all of that, Sweetness definitely earned the nickname and all the accolades that came with it. He was chosen for the FCS All-American team. He was named the Black College Player of the Year in 3 years in a row, in 73, 74, and again in 75 after he put up a legendary performance, putting up 3,600 rushing yards and scoring 7 touchdowns in one game during the 75 season. So to say Peyton was accomplished as an undergrad is a huge understatement. And the accolades don't even end there either. Even in 1972, during his sophomore season, he was already starting to set records before he was an established upperclassman, which at the time in college football was definitely given more emphasis. You weren't seeing a lot of freshmen and sophomore players get the most notoriety on a team because seniority was the precedent. So for a sophomore in 72 to be setting then best conference single game scoring record with the 7 touchdowns in a game and 2-point conversions in a game. He scored 2 in a game for 46 points on his own in a game where Jackson State won 72-0. Not to mention he also set a rushing record in that same game of 279 yards. So as a whole, over his 4 years as a Jackson State Tiger, he set so many school records, like for career rushing touchdowns with 65. He scored more than 450 total points on his own. He, again, had over 3,500 rushing yards in his college career. And all of that just showed fans and opponents just how versatile and talented he really was, even given the background of what the norms were at the time. Like, he was able to surpass all of that. Despite not being offered scholarships by big name schools and despite going to, at that point, Division 1AA school and not going to a top level school. And of course, also dealing with the stigmas that come with being an athlete of color, of course, on top of all that, which usually meant that he had to put in more effort, and he definitely exhibited that, not just off the field, but on the field as well, by adding to his role as a star-studding running back, by also being an occasional punter, a place kicker. He even returned kicks and even threw 4 touchdown passes over his 4-year career. Not to mention he was a capable pass blocker and pass receiver at the same time. So even though he was known best, obviously, for his running style and the aggressive way that he ran downfield and was just so elusive, since he was always seen to be bouncing off tacklers left and right, there was still a lot more that went into Walter Payton that met the eye. He was also known for being really rigorous in the off-season training so that it can improve his durability, and ultimately, even when he got to the NFL, that continued on, and he started more than 180 consecutive games while he was a pro. And he was rewarded for all of that effort that he put in college by having the Walter Payton Award named after him in 1987, and now it's given annually every year to the best player at the FCS level. So that just goes to show just how big of an impact he made on the college game, even from a school that most people would never have heard of in Jackson State. And that just goes to show that his individual effort overcame the uphill battle that he was facing by coming from an FCS program, and I'd say that he ended up winning out in the end, since he was taken 4th overall in the 1975 draft by the Chicago Bears, and he went on to become one of the greatest players in NFL history, arguably the greatest running back of all time, definitely up there in the conversation, and he retired as the league's leading rusher before being passed by Emmitt Smith in 2002 of the Dallas Cowboys. But even if that record doesn't belong to him anymore, he still was named first team All-Pro 7 times, voted into 9 Pro Bowls, and helped take Chicago to their only Super Bowl victory in their franchise's history, Super Bowl 20. So Sweetness was deservedly elected into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 93, and what I personally love and think is so great about Walter Payton is that his effects didn't stop when he left the field. He also had a lot of interests off the field and drew a lot of attention to them, especially when it came to helping other people. And I personally admire the way that he studied education and emphasized learning how to work with the deaf community, and he graduated with a bachelor's in communication in order to help carry those things out. And I'm obviously not the only one who thinks so, because at the time when he was making own calls to action and bringing awareness to the need for organ donations, people really responded in a positive way, and really he's credited with bringing more national attention to the problem of organ donation, which now has a much larger platform today than it did 25 years ago. And after he used his platform to bring that attention to the issue, donations even in the state of Illinois alone skyrocketed, and the regional organ bank was overwhelmed with calls at the time. And after all of that started to happen, the city of Chicago was inspired to start their own kind of organ donation program in 2000, and they had a lot of people sign up. So unfortunately, even though he was known for a lot of that charitable work, and a lot of that was personally related to a disease that he had, a rare liver disease, he sadly died in November of 1999 of a rare form of cancer. And after his death, the foundation that his family started continues to run a program that was originally organized by Payton and for causes that are close and personal to him, including one that organizes a toy drive to donate to underprivileged kids across Chicago around Christmas. And his family keeps the Walter Payton Cancer Fund going in his honor. Now it's time for our first break, but when we come back, we're going to touch on another player that's from a small southern school.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
We're back with the College Football Podcast. Now, before the break, we talked on Walter Payton and his career at Jackson State University in the state of Mississippi. And in the second segment, we're going to stay within the state of Mississippi for this next future star. But we're going to go to a different position and a different school. And in this segment, we're going to talk about none other than the legendary Jerry Rice, who came out of Mississippi Valley State. So to get started on his life, Jerry Lee Rice was born in October of 1962, also in the state of Mississippi, just like Walter Payton was. And he came from a little bit of a bigger family, if you'd like to say that. He was one of 8 kids, and his father was a bricklayer who used to put Jerry and all of his siblings to work as his assistants during the grueling, hot southern summer months while he was doing his bricklaying work. But as awful as that sounds, and as it probably was, Jerry Rice has been heard stating that it ended up working out for the best for him, because he ended up being celebrated for having strong, reliable, dependable hands. And he built that up by actually catching bricks that his brothers would throw to him while they were working with their father early on in his life. So, and you never know where all of those early, what all those early skills will end up turning into. But even despite that, Jerry Rice proved early on in his life that he was a really gifted athlete. He used to practice running up and down the dirt road in front of his house, but it wasn't even until high school that he kind of discovered that the natural athleticism that he had could be turned into a sport. And that was even kind of by accident. The story kind of goes that during high school, he was skipping classes one day, and he ran into an assistant principal who obviously was going to catch him, get him in trouble. But he sprinted away from him instead. And even though Rice was eventually caught, because high school kids can't run forever, the quickness that he showed kind of impressed the assistant principal, and he kind of brought it to the attention of the school's football coach. And long story short, they put him in some pads and lined him up as receiver. And the rest from there is history. But to go over a little bit of that history, he quickly caught on to the game and became a natural offensive threat almost right away for the team. And by the end of his high school career, he was an all-state player. He played running back, quarterback, defensive end at times, you name it. But as the story goes for a lot of other players coming up at the time, all of that effort wasn't good enough to warrant any scholarship offers from the 40 or so Division I schools that at least showed interest in him. But he wasn't able to get any offers, even from Mississippi State, which was just 20 miles away from where he lived. They didn't even bother to offer him a scholarship. But just like for Walter Payton in the first segment, there's always an offer where the talent is, even if it's not the offer that he deserved or wanted. And it was still enough to catch the eyes of a handful of college scouts who came from Mississippi Valley State. And he went and enrolled in the fall of 1981. And that's where his career in college really got started. So while in college, he ended up racking up All-American honors. He set 18 records on the FCS level, and just like Sweetness in Walter Payton, he developed the nickname World because apparently there wasn't a ball in the world that he couldn't catch, and that's where the nickname came from. And if you know anything about Jerry Rice's career, that nickname is pretty fitting. And as much as we know about his professional career, there aren't nearly as many stats or information out about his college career. It's a little bit sparse, and the assumption is that not all the records were kept as closely as they are today, but according to the College Football Hall of Fame website at least, they claim that Rice, as a sophomore in 82, had 66 catches for over 1,100 yards and 7 touchdowns in his first season, playing with a redshirt freshman at QB who was nicknamed Satellite. So together, they kind of had this cute nickname duo combination thing going. and they became known as the Satellite Express. And together they set so many NCAA records and the spread offense of their coach, who was nicknamed the Gunslinger, Archie Cooley. So they had a lot going for them, and Mississippi Valley State is one of those rare programs that, even though they're still an FCS school and they still aren't even near being in a Power 5 conference, they're still a name that you might be able to recognize, or a college football fan who has been paying attention would be able to recognize, because there are so many different aspects of their program over decades that have stuck out and become notable and have become to the level of earning a nickname. So the Gunslinger of Archie Cooley, the Satellite Express of Totten Rice Duo, all of that recognition is very well earned. And that brings us back to Rice himself, because in 1983 alone, he had a record-setting, unbelievable season, and that includes setting the NCAA record for receptions at 102, for receiving yards at 1,450, and NCAA single game catch record of 24 catches, and not to mention he was also named a first-team FCS All-American player that year. Then, as if you didn't think he could top that anymore, as a senior in 84, he broke a lot of those records again for receptions, receiving yards, and set the touchdown reception record at 27. That is the mark for all NCAA football divisions. So that alone just expresses the depth of talent that Jerry Rice held no matter what school he played for. And speaking of the school that he played for, he helped put Mississippi Valley State on the map that year, because that was the year, 1984, that the Delta Devils actually attracted national attention, believe it or not, because they scored so many points that year that they topped an average of 59 points per game, which came out to about 628 points over the season. So Power 5 school or not, they had what it took to fulfill the NCAA football formula, and Jerry Rice was a huge part of that, and they got rewarded for it by being put on the map in a real way that Group of 5 schools usually never really get put on the map. And the school themselves recognized that when they renamed their football stadium from Magnolia to Rice Totten Field in honor of their storied duo of the 80s. And they inducted Rice into the College Football Hall of Fame in August of 2006, where he rightly deserves to be. So, to cap off his career, he went on to, as we know, be drafted by the San Francisco 49ers in the first round of the 1985 draft, and that was just the start of a 20-year career in which he won multiple Super Bowls and set 38 records in the NFL, just to say the least. That's just a start. So even though he might have looked skeptical at first, especially to scouts who naturally then and now still doubt the offensive numbers that come out of conferences like the Southwestern Athletic Conference, which MVS is in, he still was able to come out and not just impress, but way surpass expectations. And he's not only one of the greatest small school players in NFL history, but he's one of the best players, if not the best player, at the wide receiver position. And you can make the case that he's one of the best players in league history regardless of position. In the 16 seasons he spent with the 49ers, he won 3 Super Bowls, earned 10 first-team All-Pro nods, and was chosen for 13 Pro Bowls. And not to mention, he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio back in 2010. And if that's not impressive enough to show how dominant and just how great Jerry Rice was, he still holds NFL records for receptions, receiving yards, and touchdowns. So dominance in the college level translated to dominance on the NFL level, and he didn't need a big-name school in order to do it. That brings us to our next break, but when we come back, we're going to hop in to another player, but we're going to stay at the same wide receiver position. Don't go anywhere.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. In the first two segments, we touched on Walter Payton and Jerry Rice and the impacts that they made at a small college before becoming superstars on the NFL level. And in this segment, it's going to be no different. We're covering another wide receiver that followed a similar career path and achieved just as much notoriety, and that is Randy Moss out of Marshall. And before we get into Randy Moss's college story, because it's an interesting one for people who aren't already aware, just to cover a little bit of his backstory and how he got to college. Randy Moss was born in February of 1997 in Rand, West Virginia, another southern state which knows a lot of athletes, especially in college, who play in southern states in college usually stay close to home. And he grew up in that small mining town with his mom and his sister and his half-brother. And fast forward to high school, Randy Moss was probably already at that point arguably the best athlete to ever come out of the state of West Virginia. He was a pro at football. He won their state's Mr. Basketball title twice. He won state championships in the 100 and 200 meter dash and track, and he was a well-rounded multi-sport athlete. But coming to the end of high school, he was recruited more for football over his track career, and it was his longtime dream to play for Notre Dame. At the time, he was also considering Ohio State because that's where his half-brother Eric played offensive tackle, but Notre Dame was still his dream, and even legendary coach Lou Holtz at the time, who was still coaching Notre Dame, said that Randy Moss was the best high school player he had ever seen. But the big problem that kept standing in Randy Moss's way was ultimately himself and the fact that he kept getting in a lot of trouble from there on out. He originally signed with his dream school in '95, Notre Dame, and even though he was called just as good as Deion Sanders, who was the measuring stick for athletic ability back then, understandably, his off-field antics kind of overshadowed that. And it really picked up after March of 1995 when he got into a fist fight at his high school that initially started allegedly because of a racially charged incident, but it ended up leaving one person in the hospital. And according to Moss's story, there was a white student who used a racist comment towards his personal friend, and he obviously had the best intentions in trying to defend his friend, but he was still charged initially with a felony for kicking the student, but that was later reduced to a misdemeanor. And later that year, in August, he pled guilty to 2 counts of misdemeanor battery, and he was sentenced to 30 days behind bars at a jail in Charleston, West Virginia. He served 3 days of that jail sentence, starting from the same night he was sentenced, and he was required to serve the remaining 27 days within the next 18 months from that day. So after that, he ended up being expelled from high school and having to complete his high school education at an alternative school nearby. And of course, because of this, Notre Dame, being the storied program that they were and are, denied his enrollment, and they didn't give him a scholarship that he was hoping for. But that didn't stop other high-profile college programs from being interested in him and reaching out to him for a chance. And it was actually recommended to him that he turn to Florida State and their head coach, Bobby Bowden, because Bowden had a reputation established already for handling troubled players and kind of being the Bill Belichick of the college football world at the time, and bringing in the players that nobody else wanted because of their quote-unquote off-field issues, and kind of just focusing their attention back on the field and getting the utmost production out of that player that might be quote-unquote troubled. So that was Randy Moss's next move, and because he already signed the letter of intent at Notre Dame, he was considered a transfer thanks to, NCAA rules, and he had to redshirt the '95 football season. So for a player that is already dealing with troubles off the field, that is definitely a challenge to put right in front of their face as a first-year student on campus away from home. As committed as he was to staying out of trouble and just keeping up with school and sports, and serving the remainder of his jail sentence after his freshman year was completed, it only took 2 weeks into his sentence in April of '96 to test positive for marijuana. And there's another setback once again for Randy Moss. He violated his probation and he was kicked out again, this time from Florida State. From there, all that was left for him to do was serve out the rest of his sentence, which he did for a week in solitary confinement and an additional 90 days due to the probation violation. And then was released in July, but with no scholarship options and no real way to play for an upper division school football program. So the only real option he had left was to accept a scholarship from an FCS school at the time called Division 1AA, and that's how he ended up at Marshall University, only about an hour from his house. And because it was an FCS level school, he was allowed to transfer there without losing any more of his eligibility, and that is the unusual journey that he took to get to Marshall, with more transfers than most star players have to make. But the detour obviously served to the benefit of his career, and the journey to the Hall of Fame truly began at Marshall in 1996. And in that first year there, he set NCAA FCS records for the most games with a touchdown catch in a season, the most consecutive games with a touchdown catch, most touchdown passes caught in a season, which tied Jerry Rice's record from his 1984 season, and most receiving yards by a freshman in a single season. And that last record is a record that still stands of just over 1,700 yards. Not to mention he was also the leading kickoff returner for that same season, leading the 96 Marshall team to an undefeated season and an FCS title, with Randy alone catching 4 touchdowns in the 1996 FCS title game. And that was Marshall's last year before moving to Division 1A level. And in their following season, at the first year at that level, in 1997, Randy and his new quarterback, Chad Pennington, which might sound familiar for some college football and NFL fans, were together the centerpiece of an even more explosive offense that led the Marshall Thundering Herd to a MAC conference title. Ultimately, all of this led up to 1997, the year that he finished as a Heisman Trophy finalist. But given the competition he was up against, it makes sense as to why he didn't necessarily walk away with the trophy. And if it was any other year, in my opinion, I think that he probably would have been able to take it easily. But he was competing with Peyton Manning and Charles Woodson, who ended up being the award winner, and they were putting up legendary seasons at the time. So it's very easy to understand why Randy Moss finished 4th that year, but it also has to be pointed out how impressive it is that he was able to finish 4th while coming from a school that you would probably never see a game of on TV. And he was up against legendary college careers in Peyton Manning at Tennessee and Charles Woodson at Michigan, who had to overcome ridiculous odds in order to win as the first defensive player ever. And as a little side note, Ryan Leaf as well, who, if NFL fans were paying attention at the time, didn't really have a notable pro career to speak of, but he was really highly regarded in college and had a lot of expectations based off of his college performance. So Randy was really going up against a lot, but he still managed to play well enough to stand out and was intriguing enough to be picked in the first round of the 1998 draft by the Minnesota Vikings. And even then, he was considered one of the most talented players available. He slid to number 21 because of all of the concerns about his off-field issues and whether or not they would seep into the NFL and his gameplay. But those issues and concerns were quickly put to bed once Randy Moss actually hit the field for the Minnesota Vikings. And now he is by far one of the greatest wide receivers ever, after putting up a legendary NFL career, earning Offensive Rookie of the Year honors, leading the league in receiving 5 times, being selected as a 4-time first-team All-Pro, chosen for the Pro Bowl 6 times, and now officially a Hall of Famer. And the legend of Randy Moss lives on. Despite his bumpy start, we're now using his last name as a football-centric verb to refer to other players who are playing unbelievably great. So if that isn't proof that big talent can come from small places, then I don't know what would be. That brings us to our next break. But when we come back, we're going to keep diving in. But in the next segment, we're going to switch to a different position player. Don't go anywhere.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's GSMCpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
We're back with the College Football Podcast. So far in this episode, we've covered 3 players who went from small schools to superstar status, covering Walter Payton, Jerry Rice, and Randy Moss. Now, in this 4th segment, we're going to switch gears to cover a different position, the only tight end on this list, and that person is Shannon Sharpe, who came out of Savannah State. And Shannon Sharpe, born June of 1968 in Chicago, actually grew up in Glenville, Georgia, and he actually kind of grew up impoverished a little bit, but he put his focus into sports and started in high school as the school's running back, quarterback, and linebacker. But he didn't just stop there. Not only was he all-county, all-region, and all-area in football alone, but he also lettered in football 4 times and earned letters in basketball 3 times and 4 times in track. As a junior, he was breaking Georgia state records already, even in track, on the triple jump, and rebroke that same record as a senior. But if the name Sharpe sounds familiar for any other reason, that's because he's the younger brother of another former NFL star, although one who didn't reach the same heights he did, but his wide receiver brother, Sterling Sharpe, was 3 years older than him and kind of left a large shadow for Shannon to fill in as he grew up. So Sterling was the big brother who was the star on their local football team and went on to have an All-American career at South Carolina and an All-Pro career with the Green Bay Packers after being drafted. And when it came to Shannon, he decided to stay in-state and sign with a Division II school, which we now know is Savannah State. And when he got there, he continued on being a multi-sport athlete, playing football on top of basketball and track and field, just like he did in high school. But when you're looking at his collegiate career, it can kind of be summed up just by using any kind of word that you would use to sum up incredible. He was tremendous. He was outstanding. Any word that you choose, though, you got to times it by 3, because there's so many accolades that he achieved not just once, but 3 times, such as being named an All-American, did that 3 times, being named to the All-Southern Intercollegiate Athletic Conference selection team between 87 and 89. He did that too. You could add Conference Offensive Player of the Year to that list 3 more times, and he did all of that multiple times while being named as the conference's Player of the Year in 1987 and leading the team in receptions in each of the 4 years he was on campus. So the impact of Shannon Sharpe's play was directly related to the success that the program saw in his years there. They had 2 of the best seasons that they had in their entire school's history in 88 and 89 while he was a player there. And Shannon ended up finishing his 4-year career at Savannah State with 192 receptions, over 3,700 yards, and 40 touchdown catches. And to top all of that off, in his last 2 games, he became the first Savannah State player to play in the Blue-Gray Classic and in the East-West Shrine game. So, needless to say, he deservedly was inducted into the Division II Hall of Fame in 2009. So, given his ridiculous dominance in college, especially at the tight end position, and following in his brother's footsteps as he had done for his entire life, it only seemed natural that he would move on to the NFL as his next step. But the NFL and most teams had a different idea, because they were kind of thinking that somebody built like Shannon Sharpe, so chiseled, standing at 6'2", 230 pounds at the time, was too slow for a wide receiver, but too small for a tight end. So that kind of put him a little bit of a dilemma, and Shannon Sharpe, on top of being from a small school that's not getting national attention, had the standard doubts surrounding him from NFL teams and slid way down in the draft to the 7th round. And that's where the Denver Broncos eventually took him in 1990. And they initially had an intention of playing him at wide receiver. And they'd had success before with similar players that also came from small programs, like Billy Thompson, Rod Smith. But even up until that point, they'd never seen anything like Shannon Sharpe. And I'd argue that we really, for the most part, haven't seen anything like Shannon Sharpe ever since. So when it comes to the Broncos, and when it comes to tight ends in the 90s, he definitely leads the way, especially in the early 90s. And he was switched to tight end under Dan Reeves, and that ended up probably being the best possible decision for his career, because he went on to win 3 Super Bowls, 2 with his original team, the Broncos, and 1 with the Ravens, and being an 8-time Pro Bowler, enshrined in the Hall of Fame as part of the class of 2001, and not to mention when he left the game, he was pretty much the leading tight end in every category that you can think of. So Shannon Sharpe ended up being a 14-year NFL veteran, but he had a hell of a trek of not just 4 years in college, but overcoming being Sterling Sharpe's younger brother to eventually earn his spot in Canton, Ohio. That brings us to our next break, but you won't want to go anywhere, because when we come back, we'll take a look at the one player on this list that's still actively playing football. Don't go anywhere.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA, from the UFC to extreme cage fighting. They got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. Now, in the first 4 segments, we covered 4 athletes that became NFL superstars, but had humble beginnings in small colleges and on small stages. Walter Payton, Jerry Rice, Randy Moss, and Shannon Sharpe. And that brings us to the last athlete on the list, who is also the only one who is still actively playing football. So his name definitely should be very well known by football fans all over, and that is Ben Roethlisberger, who was drafted out of Miami, but Miami that's in Ohio, so not the University of Miami in Florida, that is a Power 5 school and is very well known. But given Roethlisberger's background, it makes sense that he went to a smaller Ohio school, given that he was born in March of 1982 in Lima, Ohio, and grew up just outside of Findlay, Ohio, nearby, and became really active in sports, specifically basketball, football, and baseball. And by the time he got to the high school level at Findlay High, he was the team captain in all 3 of them and was named All-League, All-District in both basketball and baseball. But everyone still has their humble beginnings, and the Big Ben that we all know today was nothing more than a thin, lanky wide receiver before he became nationally known. And it wasn't even until his final year in high school in 1999 that he even had the chance to be a quarterback, and the number 1 quarterback at that, after the quarterback in front of him graduated. And did I mention that that quarterback also happened to be the head coach's son? So that head coach, in hindsight, in an interview since, has said that he considers himself a nationally known knucklehead for starting his own son over the Ben Roethlisberger we have come to know today. And he really should, because the Ben we know today was definitely foreshadowed starting from his high school performances, because he was even setting records back then. He set state high school records for yards thrown, over 4,000, for touchdowns thrown, 54, and he played in a high-power offense that was kind of mimicking a college-level offense, and even more specifically, it was kind of designed similar to Miami, Ohio's. So he may not have been super nationally recognized at the time just yet, but he was no secret in the state of Ohio. And when he popped up on Miami's radar, they invited him to a summer camp before his senior season. He didn't leave with a scholarship offer at the time, but in the end, we know Miami won out, and he ended up choosing them because he had a shot at being a 4-year starter, since their then number one QB, Mike Bath, had his eligibility expiring. So Big Ben is coming into a Division I school as a redshirt freshman off of just 1 year as a starting quarterback in high school, and threw for over 3,100 yards in that first year. In 2002, he topped it again with 3,200, and in 2003, he flew past that with 4,400 yards. While he was with Miami, the Red Hawks had an unbeaten season in the MAC. They were all the way up to number 10 in the AP rankings poll. And by the end of his college career, he held every major passing record in the school's history. And on top of that, a number of passing records in the MAC, the Mid-American Conference. So he was able to put up numbers in 1 year of high school and put up numbers in 3 years of college, as opposed to the 4 that most players were taking, especially at the time. And the numbers in those 3 years were outstanding, for a combined total of 10,830 yards and 84 touchdowns between 2001 and 2003. And specifically, his junior campaign was one for the ages, with almost 4,500 yards and 37 touchdowns that year alone, which led the school to 12 consecutive wins, a MAC championship, and a GMAC Bowl victory that year. So it made sense when they, only for the third time in their school's history, retired his football jersey during homecoming 2007. And if they're breaking out the rafters for you after 34 years of not retiring another jersey before yours, then I'm just saying that it looks like you have had some major impacts on not just the school, but on college football as a whole. And specifically for Miami, Ohio, they get a little more attention than the other schools on this list, especially because they're in a huge football-loving state like Ohio, and play schools like Ohio State that usually get on TV. But with all of that being said, you don't really see a lot of superstars coming out of that school. Like, if you were to ask a college football fan who maybe wasn't a serious in-depth fan to name the last person they heard of out of Miami, Ohio, off the top of their head, they probably wouldn't be able to give you a name unless they were talking about Big Ben himself. And even then, some fans might be still finding out that that's where he went to school. So I would definitely say that Big Ben put Miami, Ohio on the map, and he naturally went on to be drafted to the NFL in the 2004 draft, which is still to this day considered a legendary draft. And even though he was taken relatively high with the number 11 pick by none other than the Pittsburgh Steelers, he got to that team in his rookie season as the number 3 quarterback on the depth chart. But once he got on the field earlier than planned, obviously because it was injury related after Tommy Maddox went down in week 2, and the other backup, Charlie Batch, wasn't necessarily medically ready. He was sidelined with a knee himself, and that is when Big Ben was introduced to the mainstream football world. And with his first start, he led the Steelers to a win over the Dolphins and never gave that starting job back. Since then, the rest has become history. He's played in He's been to 3 Super Bowls, he's won 2 of them, and he's been selected for the Pro Bowl 6 different times. He's known now especially for playing the quarterback position outside of the pocket and like the backyard football style. And he's kind of become known for popularizing that style for his generation in modern football, kind of modeling off of who he says is one of his childhood idols, John Elway, when he was quarterbacking the Denver Broncos. The playing style and the fourth quarter comebacks have become the foundation of Ben's future Hall of Fame career, and we've seen him struggle in recent years with injuries, especially like last season when an injury cut short his 2019 season. But Ben is still 38. He's eyeing a comeback for whenever we have football returning. And now with a repaired elbow and maybe other surgically repaired body parts that may not be the most ideal for your starting quarterback, but he has all the confidence in himself and it shows that he'll be at full strength whenever the season starts. And given his entire career history, he has more than earned the benefit of the doubt from fans to see whether or not the 38-year-old can come back at full strength when the season starts and prove that he still got it. That brings us to our final break. But when we come back, we're going to take a look at the other end of the spectrum and look at college stars who didn't exactly make it on the NFL level. Don't go anywhere.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. In this episode, we touched on 5 players that went on to become NFL legends, but started humbly in small schools. Now for this final segment, we're going to take a look at the opposite situation, and for this last segment, we're going to focus more on the opposite situation. Players who were stars in college and had high expectations placed on them, but kind of ended up being busts when they hit the pro level. And a lot of that has to do with the draft and all of the promise and potential that it provides for not just teams, but fans of teams themselves too. And ultimately, it just comes down to being a random series of calculated gambles. There's no such thing as a sure thing when you're looking at players who dominate on the college level and are trying to evaluate how that talent is going to translate to the pro level. There are tons of examples of guys who were dynamo, can't miss guys on the college level, but when you bring up the topic of NFL busts, there are certain names that you're going to hear over and over again and come to the top of the list. So the fact that we know there are a lot of variables that need to be considered and not every team hits on every pick, even today with all of the data and tools that are available to assess stats and even intangibles of the game, there are a lot of teams that are still scratching their heads and asking themselves what were they thinking when they picked some of these players. So for this last segment, we're going to take a look at 5 players that became a shadow of their former college selves once they reached the pro level. And the first player that tops that list, at least for me, that comes to mind recently, is Trent Richardson. And he was taken in 2012 after Andrew Luck and RG3. So there were a lot of expectations coming out of the draft that year, and he was highly praised. Definitely one of the, if not the top prospect at the running back position when he was drafted. And him, along with his fellow top 3 picks, were all expected to be transformative talents, and they were going to save their franchises and bring them back to relevancy. And not so much we saw from that draft. All 3 of those players, not a single one of them is starting for an NFL team. And Robert Griffin III is the only one out of that group that's still even in the NFL, which if you look back 8 years ago, you never would have guessed that this is the situation and how it would turn out. But with Andrew Luck's surprise retirement and RG3's injury problems and how they became too much for most locker rooms to want to handle, and then Trent Richardson on top of that, who basically just shot himself in the foot until he was out of the league before he even played 50 games. So, talk about unpredictable. Especially since coming out of Alabama, he was dominating college football in his final year and putting up stats like 2,000 yards from scrimmage and finding the end zone 24 times. But then came the Cleveland Browns, and as any football fan knows, the Cleveland Browns are where careers go to die, even good ones. Like Joe Thomas, if you want to ask him for his opinion on playing his entire career with the Cleveland Browns. Because even the good careers are wasted in Cleveland, but Trent Richardson couldn't even get that. He quickly found out that his college skill set wasn't going to translate well into the NFL against NFL level competition, and it really didn't help that he's going from the offensive line that's protecting him and creating holes for him at Alabama to the Browns line, which outside of Joe Thomas, of course, is always just absolutely dreadful, and he had so much trouble finding space to run and even just staying on his feet. He was constantly being tackled at the line of scrimmage right after receiving the handoff from the quarterback, and he only made it to 46 games, and in that span, he only came up with 3,000 yards from scrimmage and 19 touchdowns. And from there, he was bounced out of the league, and a stint in the CFL is where he ended up. But needless to say, a number 3 overall pick definitely did not live up to the hype that surrounded him 8 years ago. And speaking of hype surrounding a player, that brings us to the next one on our list. And there is no shortage of hype around this player, and that doesn't even just get capped at football. And this is Tim Tebow, probably the most well-known college football star in recent history. And having been drafted in 2010, 10 years ago, in the first round at number 25, realistically as a quarterback, he should still be in the NFL. But the thing about Tim Tebow is that he could never really throw, and at Florida, he had tremendous success. He was seen as one of the best college football players, definitely at the time, but even arguably amongst the all-time conversation. But he was mostly running the ball within his 4 seasons there. Now, when he got to the NFL, he was throwing it more, but that ratio points out what he was used to in college and the discrepancy between that and the NFL. So that college offense with low-risk passes and quarterback runs and the quarterback option constantly is one thing. But if you're trying to translate to the NFL, especially the NFL 10 years ago, it really didn't work out. I mean, he had his relative success. He was a very big, sturdy guy, especially for a quarterback at 240 pounds, 6'2", but he's not exactly Big Ben, so it's not difficult for NFL defenders to get him on the ground, and that's the reason why the game he was playing in college just was not going to work for him when he was with the Broncos. And he does have that playoff win under his belt against Pittsburgh. Those who are for him are always going to point to that, but a lot of that was based off of their dominant defense at the time and the receiving, notably Demaryius Thomas, who took in that overtime score to win that playoff game, because Tim Tebow specifically, had a completion percentage that was below 50% in that game. So he just showed that he simply couldn't adapt to the NFL pro-style offenses. His career stats reflected that. He didn't even amass a 50% completion percentage over his career. But teams, because of his name, were willing to give Tim Tebow other opportunities in the NFL. They wanted him to switch positions. He never did that. He eventually transitioned into minor league baseball, where he also had foundational issues in that game too. And now he has ended up behind a desk as an analyst for college football games, and he seems to finally have found something that he is completely qualified to do. So kudos to Tim Tebow for landing on his feet in a place that he can actually excel. But unfortunately, not every player that goes bust gets a fortunate ending and lands on their feet the way Tebow did. And another player that falls into that category is definitely Johnny Manziel. And Johnny Manziel is probably, outside of Tebow, the most famous college football player in recent years. And there was so much hype surrounding this player and surrounding Johnny Manziel when he was coming out of A&M that by the time he got to the Cleveland Browns for his first stint in the NFL, notice I said first stint, which just lasted 15 games, he was already validating the suspicions and concerns that teams had about him when he was coming out of college. Because as much as he put up on the field and performed while he was at Texas A&M and even won the Heisman Trophy in his final year, he was victim to his own immaturity a lot of the time. And there are a lot of situations in college where he would put himself out there and fall flat on his face. And those qualities and character traits aren't really the kinds that NFL teams are looking for. We've seen that so notably, historically. Teams shy away from those things for a reason. And because of all of that, he didn't live up to the hype that he put on himself by being in the spotlight all the time. And he did play for the Cleveland Browns, so it's not like his team helped. And his supporting cast definitely didn't do him any favors there. But when you brand yourself as Johnny Manziel and you have the type of phenomenal, unstoppable college career that saw almost 8,000 passing yards and 63 touchdowns through the air and 30 more touchdowns on the ground in just over 2 seasons, you definitely have set yourself up with something to live up to. And the contrast to his on-field success was his off-field partying. And when both of those things come to the professional level at once, it turns into a different story. And Johnny Football proved that he wasn't ready yet at that point to come into the game and treat it like a professional. And he has since fallen out of favor with every single team. He has stopped for a long time getting any more offers. And he even worked his way back onto a few radars and into a stint in the CFL with a couple of teams, but since then has fallen back off of the radar. And if there are any moves left to be seen from Johnny Football, I guess we'll see. But for now, that is the end of his story, which brings us to the next player's story. And this player is Tim Couch. And if anybody hasn't heard of Tim Couch yet, he kind of has a similar story to Johnny Manziel in the way that he had such high expectations after a spectacular college career, but then took a really huge nosedive when he got to Cleveland. And unfortunately for him, he was the beginning benchmark for Cleveland's second NFL stint. And armed with the number 1 pick, they took Couch, obviously based off of his impressive 3 years at Kentucky. And in those 3 years, he threw for almost 8,500 yards and more than twice as many touchdowns as interceptions. So seemingly at the time, a team that was picking him just couldn't go wrong. But sadly, like everybody else on this list, he just couldn't live up to that hype. And while in comparison, he did have a little bit of a longer career than some of the other players that are on this list, he managed to get to 59 starts. But even though he played that often, it doesn't mean he was playing that well. He was basically a garbage fire in each one of those starts and ended that 59-game stretch with a touchdown to interception ratio that was worse than 1-to-1. He had 64 touchdowns to 67 interceptions. And even though he did have a winning record in 2002 with Cleveland, which it says a lot for the Browns, he still ended up being one in a line of first-round draft picks by Cleveland that have ended up not helping the franchise, but kind of dooming the franchise instead, and kind of subjecting them to a whole cycle of high picks, but with low payoff. And Tim Couch, unfortunately, is just another example of a player that got caught in the Cleveland Browns franchise purgatory. And that brings us to the last player on this list, and he is arguably one of the biggest NFL busts of all time when you measure out the level of talent that was expected, the college career that had been put up behind him, the pick he was taken at, and the result of the career that followed. And none of those things equaled each other. And it's honestly quite incredible to watch a quarterback who is capable of throwing the ball at one point for 65 yards from one knee end up being an NFL bust. And Jamarcus Russell ended up becoming that nightmare situation of a player in the NFL who was drafted first overall in the 2007 draft, but failed to live up to not only the college hype, but definitely the hype that comes with being the number one overall pick, because you'd reasonably expect a player that you're spending your top draft pick on and is meant to flip your franchise to at least make more than 25 total career starts. And it worked out especially bad for the Oakland Raiders, because at the time he was drafted, the NFL didn't have the rookie pay scale in place, so drafted players were able to negotiate their own deals and get whatever they wanted, especially if it was based off of hype. And some hilariously terrible deals came out of this one, and especially specifically for Jamarcus Russell, because after he was drafted, he signed a 6-year, $61 million deal with $40 million guaranteed. And before he even stepped onto the field and became a disappointment, he already had $40 million in the bank. So that was clearly a horrible decision by the Raiders at the time. They did not get any return on that investment. And even in the drafts that followed, the Raiders have struggled to collect first-round picks that have actually made an impact on their franchise. So at this point, you could make an entire list of just Oakland and Raider first-round flops alone. And ultimately, all of these players are examples that college success isn't the only qualifier for NFL success, and it doesn't necessarily determine how a career is going to turn out. But one thing we can tell from all of these examples, funnily enough, is that not every player plays better once he starts getting paid. Thanks for listening to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.